We are called to face heartbreak, to acknowledge heartbreak, to endure heartbreak, to persevere in faith through it. See, that's the irony of discipleship in Jesus' name. It does not save us from heartbreak. It does not make our lives easier. It does not promise that tragedy will not come for us. It cannot do that. In any proclamation of the gospel that would try to say that would be the case is a lie. It is heresy. It is falsehood. But instead, Jesus instructs us to live lives that our hearts might break at the very things that break God's heart. And there is much in our world this day that is breaking God's heart. Global wars and violence like the conflict that we see in Israel and Gaza and Russia and Ukraine is breaking God's heart. Climate change and environmental degradation, poor stewardship of creation is breaking God's heart. Social injustice that oppresses and marginalizes women and African Americans and people in the queer community is breaking God's heart. The current state of American politics is breaking God's heart. Society's wholesale abandonment of children and of young families, including the educational crisis, is breaking God's heart. Grieving the death of loved ones who are so dear to us that when they died, they took a piece of our soul with them is grieving God's heart. This list, friends, is not exhaustive, but merely illustrative. So insert anything else that exists on your list here. You see, because acknowledging heartbreak, it can be so painful. It can be so threatening. Can be so frightening. Because of that, we're inclined to live like the disciples that we saw in our scripture lesson the first time Jesus predicts his death. We're inclined to live in a state of denial. And if not necessarily denial, then a state of willful ignorance in which we choose to avert our eyes, in which we choose to pretend that things are fine, or simply to distract ourselves by focusing on other things, or by not choosing to focus on the things that are breaking God's heart. But Christ's call to his disciples, to us as his apprentices, our call that Christ speaks to us is that we would wake up from this sleepwalking, wake up from our slumber, open our eyes, look and see, and be people who actually allow these things to break our hearts. Jesus invites us to be people who weep and who lament. There is, after all, a book in the scriptures called the Book of Lamentations, which mercifully gives us permission to be people who are allowed to have our hearts break. People who are allowed to not pretend we can do this life on our own and it does not bring us to our knees. Jesus invites us to be people who, in the midst of the heartbreak and the sorrow we experience, to turn to God, perhaps in rage and in anger, with questions of doubt or wondering why God might let this happen, to turn to God in the midst of our pain and our woundedness, to turn to God in hope and out of hope and in love and in desperation and in need, and to recognize in God wholeness and fullness, healing. Jesus dares us as his disciples to be fully awake to all the suffering in this world that breaks people's hearts. See, we are called, Jesus says, to be people of compassion and people of empathy, to not only experience our sorrows, but to willingly experience the sorrows that would break others' hearts as well.